Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. We're executive directors of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this show. Today, we'll be talking with Cait West, who has a gripping story about breaking away from Christian patriarchy.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at FFRF.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
And welcome to Freethought Matters. How many women are still trapped in Christian patriarchy? Cait West was raised in the Christian purity movement, where women are taught to be completely subservient to fathers. She eventually found the courage to break away and is now a writer and editor based in Michigan. She co-hosts the Survivors Discuss podcast and currently serves on the editorial board for Tears of Eden, a nonprofit providing resources for survivors of spiritual abuse.
Cait West is also the author of the riveting new memoir, Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy. In her book, Cait West explains that in Christian patriarchy, each family's father is deemed a prophet, priest, even a Christ figure. Thank you so much for joining us today, Cait.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
So I loved your book, Cait. You grew up in the Christian patriarchy movement. What is the Christian patriarchal movement and how widespread is it?
So my understanding of the Christian patriarchy movement is starting in the 1990s of my experience. There was something called Patriarch Magazine and a kind of a grassroots movement of male pastors who were promoting this idea that men are in charge of all aspects of society and that women should submit to them. And this is based on really literal interpretation of the Bible, especially the Old Testament. And it became more and more popular through the homeschooling movement as well. And so organizations like Bill Gothard's Institute and Basic Life Principles, if you're familiar with the Duggar family, as well as Vision Forum, which was my experience. That was another organization that promoted this movement, and it increased over time. It taught things like girls like me couldn't go to college or work a job. We had to live with our fathers until our fathers helped us find a husband to get married to, and then we were expected to have as many children as possible. This has become more and more popular, but in more recent years, these terms aren't as used. So terms like quiverful, Christian patriarchy, they might be more insider terms, and they aren't used so much publicly. So there are still a lot of people who live this way, but they might not use that terminology.
So can you tell us about your childhood and your life under Christian patriarchy?
I grew up in a conservative Presbyterian Protestant home, very Calvinist. And when I was 5 years old, my parents pulled me out of the Christian school I was going to and decided to start homeschooling. And my older siblings had gone to public school before going to Christian school. And so even in that, you can see this escalation of my father's beliefs changing and becoming more strict, because homeschooling became this idea that it's the only way to educate your children if you want to raise them to be godly. And my life became more and more isolated after that. So homeschooling, and then we moved to a more conservative church. We became more involved in this patriarchal movement. Um, my life was very limited. Once I hit the age of 10, I homeschooled myself. I was given books and taught myself how to do a lot of subjects, and even graded my own tests and things like that. And so it was very much an isolated experience, but this experience of feeling like I was part of a bigger movement, a bigger community through our church, taught that I was supposed to be part of this generation that would bring these ideas to the bigger world. And I think we see that now with political movements of these kinds of beliefs getting into our policies, especially around women's rights. And so I was part of that generation that was supposed to do that, but I chose a different way.
So you were part of this community, but you were subservient to it. You were never taught that you had any individual rights as a person. What did that mean for you, like on a day-to-day basis, for your father to have complete control of your life?
I didn't have any real decision-making power in my life. I mean, as a child, it wasn't so noticeable, and I trusted my parents to do what was right. But the older I got, the more I felt those restrictions. And once I turned 18, I wasn't allowed to leave the home. I didn't realize that I had rights as an adult. And so I ended up staying till I was 25. And my father controlled my relationships, what I could do on the day-to-day basis, down to what music I listened to, what books I could read. There was a lot of control in that. And I lost my sense of self because of that, because it was easier to survive if I conformed and I followed my dad's preferences.
You say that fundamentalism makes you think in binaries. What do you mean by that?
In fundamentalism, which is, it could happen in any kind of religion, or even I think there can be secular fundamentalists. It's this idea that there's only one good and only one evil, or there's this concept of us versus them. And so when I was in this movement, we were the ones with the truth, with the correct understanding of God, and everybody else was wrong and bound for eternal punishment. And that way of thinking was hard to dismantle, because I wasn't taught to understand nuance or gray areas, and that took a lot of critical thinking, and I had to learn that on my own after leaving.
You just had to follow the rules no matter what without questioning, huh? So I was surprised to read in your book that even when you were an adult, even in your early 20s, I think up to age 24, you were still under your father's control. You have this term, stay-at-home daughter. What does that mean, stay-at-home daughter?
A stay-at-home daughter is part of this whole idea of Christian patriarchy, or the quiverful movement, where girls are meant to become wives and mothers. So in that world, it doesn't make sense for them to leave home, to go to college, to have a career, because that just teaches them independence and how to think for themselves. So the best way to get them to stay in that lifestyle is to keep them at home and train them how to be household keepers. And so I stayed home, and I was learning how to do a grocery budget, and my father would send me out to homeschool other people's children, and do things that followed this idea of mothering and nurturing. Nothing that I wanted to do, but anything that followed this plan of how do I become a wife one day.
So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the religious ideology that you were brought up in. You said it was very Calvinist. So was sin and innate depravity emphasized? How was all this conveyed to you?
Yes. So I grew up in a very Calvinistic Presbyterian tradition, and I was told from before I can remember that human beings are depraved and we're born sinful. And so this idea that I was in my dad's words, a dirty, wretched sinner, I really took that to heart and internalized that. And it made me really have a lot of self-hatred and also hatred of other people, because I thought that we were all just horrible creatures who needed to be saved. And it taught me to have a really cynical view of the world.
Well, Dan, you used to be a soul winner. Do you?
Yeah, I know. Well, you can't sell salvation without first selling damnation. You have to convince the person that they need what the Bible offers, what the blood of Jesus offers. And so, yeah, I grew up in fundamentalists as well, thinking that we were all deserving of eternal punishment, but the grace of Jesus saved all of us.
But you were allowed to get out of the house.
Well, I was a guy, so I didn't have any sisters. I don't know, but...
So speaking of how women in particular are picked on by Christian patriarchal religions, you write about how you imbibed the idea that a woman's body was a dangerous thing, a vessel for someone else's sin. Is this idea of women as sin inciting, is that at the heart of the Christian patriarchal movement?
I think so. I think misogyny in general is just at the core of this teaching. And we see that in purity culture. I think that's something that more people might understand, is the concept of purity culture, and how this belief of women need to be sexually pure and maintain that purity and save men from lust or lustful thoughts. And that was continued with us. But even to a more extreme of emotional purity, and we had to maintain emotional distance from anyone of the opposite sex. So even if you were in a courtship with someone, you weren't allowed to have an emotional connection until you were committed to getting married. And so this idea of women being basically property to be controlled and protected and kept pure was very core to the belief system.
So in a minute, we're going to talk about how you managed to break free from all of that. But I was fascinated by the fact that in your culture, under your dad, there was this very strict process for getting married. What were those exact steps that you had to go through?
So we used a guidebook called The Pathway to Christian Marriage, and this is still available online as a pamphlet you can download. And it taught this very strict view of how fathers control relationships. And it based the ideas on cherry-picked verses from the Old Testament, like how Abraham found a wife for his son Isaac. And it created this system of how fathers could determine who was eligible to marry their daughters and then control the relationship in order to reach a betrothal. And so a betrothal was a term that we used instead of engagement. And when you were betrothed, you would sign a covenant of commitment to get married to that person. So if you broke a betrothal, it was the same impact as a divorce in our community.
Could you hold hands and kiss during a betrothal?
Those kinds of things were up to the father. Like every father had different rules. In my family, by the time it got to me, there was no contact whatsoever until you were betrothed, and then you could hold hands, but you couldn't kiss until your wedding day.
And dating? Was dating allowed?
No. So all of this was chaperoned interactions, usually with your father, just to determine if you were a good match. And really what that meant was if your father thought the match was good.
Well, this is leading up to, I think, what ultimately caused you to break away from Christian patriarchal religion. And when we come back, excuse me, we will ask you how you finally broke away from the oppressive system of Christian patriarchy.
We'll be right back with more of Cait West, author of the book Rift.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
Welcome back to Freethought Matters.
We're continuing our conversation with Cait West, the author of the riveting new book, Rift, a Memoir of Breaking Away from Christian Patriarchy. So, Cait, let's cut to the end here. How did you find the courage to leave?
You know, this is always a difficult question because it was never a leaving in a one-day kind of situation. I think anyone going from an abusive home trying to leave, it takes a lot of time and work. And for me, it had to start with the mental barrier of needing to understand that I needed to leave, that I had the option to leave. And so my first courtship was when I really realized how much control my father had over my life when he ended that relationship. And I felt really heartbroken that I had no say and that I lost this relationship, that I thought I was going to get married and move on with my life. My father ended it. And then my father told me that I needed to repent for my emotions, like I said, emotional purity. And so that moment, I realized he was lying to me, that something was not right with that statement, that it couldn't be wrong to love someone. And even that was a dangerous thought that I kept to myself. But that really changed how I thought about the world, that experience. And I was 21 at the time. It wasn't until I was 25 that I actually left. And in that time, I had to save some money. I was allowed to work as a piano teacher because I didn't have a boss other than my dad, and I could do it out of the home. So I was allowed to do that. I saved some money. I started thinking of ways to leave. And then right when I was maybe going to leave, I fell in love with somebody else. And I decided to stick around a little bit longer and see how that panned out. And that is a big part of the story, is that relationship, how I had that against the permission of my father, and how I got married against his permission and moved here to Michigan to start a new life. And that was, the big rift that I talk about, but also healing for me has always been returning to the past and trying to reckon with what happened at the same time as learning how to be an adult and independent in the world, teaching myself how to get a job through applying for jobs, going to college. That's a huge part of the latter end of the book, is me trying to figure out all those things.
Well, that must have been incredibly hard, but I want to go back to that first courtship. Am I remembering your book correctly that the young man turned out to be gay? Was that part of why your father broke it off, or was that just a coincidence?
He didn't break it off for that reason, because there was this belief that people aren't gay and that that's a choice. And so even though there were signs that that might be a possibility, that was not the reason. And so I didn't find this out until years later. And it wouldn't have been a good relationship for either of us. And I think that's, the blessing in disguise that it didn't work out. And my father has very arbitrary reasons for stopping my relationships. And I talk about a few of these in my book, but once I count them all, there was about 4 relationships that my father ended. And so I'm not sure what that's about. Maybe he was trying to just keep me home forever, and no one was ever good enough for him.
Well, wasn't part of it that he required the guy to have, $50,000 in the bank and all of these, to be a good supporting husband?
Yeah, you had to have a certain amount of money, or you had to have a house, or you had to have a college degree. It was always a shifting goalposts because, it was all about control.
So speaking of gay, turns out that your brother also was gay. Did he come out before or after? He
came out right around the time when I was leaving, and I'm so proud of my brother for doing that and for finding how to be authentic to himself. And it was very disruptive. Both of our situations were very disruptive in the family. And I can't even imagine all the pain he had to go through and in the ways that homophobia showed up in our house and in our church. There was a lot of hatred. And so it was really brave for him to come out to our family and to live his life as who he is. And so he was a big inspiration for me because he, taught me how to really love other people.
So, what about the psychological abuse or the other kinds of abuse that you experienced?
Sure. So I talk in my book about different kinds of abuse that aren't displayed in physical ways. And so psychological abuse is when someone tries to control how you think. So there's a lot of gaslighting, there's a lot of emotional manipulation. That was definitely happening. And then also spiritual abuse is something I talk about as using God or religion or a scripture to control somebody. When you tell someone you have to live at home until you get married, and that's because God told me to, that adds this extra level of importance to that. And so if you break those rules, you're breaking the law of God. So it has this extra weight that can really disrupt someone's spirituality and how they think about the world.
And, I don't want to pry, but wasn't there also corporal punishment and in the Christian patriarchal movement, sexual abuse?
Yes. And so my experience was with, spanking, and that was very common in our circles. That was taught from the pulpit. And I talk about my pastor, whose name is Kevin Swanson, and he preached that from the pulpit, that you needed to spank your children, and it was okay. I quote in the book that he said it was okay if there were bruises because bruises could heal.
Well, that's right out of the Bible.
Right. And it's really disturbing to me now to hear that and realize so many parents went along with that. In terms of sexual abuse, there was no concept of marital rape in this culture. And so women were expected to be 24/7 available to their husbands. And so I know that marital rape was happening. That didn't happen to me. I got out before I got into a bad marriage. But yeah, it's very distressing how much, criminal activity might have been happening.
Well, I have to say, Cait, you are a very talented writer. You have some real ability there. And you titled the book Rift. Why did you pick the word rift as a title?
So there's this idea of me breaking away from my family and leaving home and having a before and an after. And part of that is a little bit of a misnomer because there is no straight split between a before and after. You carry your past with you, and that was what I had to learn, is to integrate my past into who I am now. And also I really love writing about nature, and so writing about geology and the movement of the earth provided this bigger metaphor for me to contrast with my own experiences of shift in my life.
So you went from homeschooling yourself to self-educating yourself. Look at the books behind you. Didn't you go on to college? I mean, this is an amazing transformation, really.
Yeah, I mean, I got out and I got my first job, a minimum wage job, and then I worked my way through community college and eventually went to university to study writing. And so I was able to live my dreams finally. It was a lot of work, a lot of hustling, but it was definitely worth it.
Are you still in touch with your family?
Yes, so I have relationships with all my siblings, which is really great. And I do have limited contact with my mom, but I am currently no contact with my father for about 5 years now.
Yeah, you write that you and your dad have different definitions of the word love. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so all of this, patriarchy was taught. That was the word we used. It was taught as love. This is protection. It's to keep you safe and to give you the right path. And then I realized how much it was affecting me and how I became very ill. Like I had depression, I had anxiety, I was sick all the time. And I realized how harmful it was to me, and I didn't feel like my true self. And so I had to readjust my definition of what love was, because I had been taught from the Bible, you study the fruits of something to see um, if it was a good tree or not. And so around me, I was realizing the fruit is really bad here. And so something must be really wrong with the system I'm living in.
You've condemned the reversal of Roe versus Wade and said it reminded you of what it felt like to be a woman in the Christian patriarchal movement. So quite a transformation, because you're a feminist today, aren't you?
Yes. Yes. So, feminist used to be the word that was an insult that my father used against me. And now I claim it as, a big part of my identity. And learning about my body, like I was not taught about my body or consent. So I was very pro-life because I was indoctrinated to be that way. And so once I started learning about my body and wanting to be able to have control over what happened to my body, that helped me realize that I was more for reproductive rights than against. And, it's something I'm really passionate about now, is promoting people's agency.
So anybody finding themselves in the situation you are, they can go to Tears of Eden? Is that a website?
Yeah, so I volunteer with Tears of Eden. It's at tearsofeden.org, and it's a nonprofit that helps spiritual abuse survivors coming out of evangelicalism. And we have virtual support groups. We have written resources. We have interviews. There's an archive of podcasts that people can find some solidarity and support as they're healing from this. And there's no agenda to that. A lot of spiritual abuse organizations are affiliated with churches, and so ours is not, and it's committed to supporting people wherever they are and wherever they want to end up.
Well, thank you for joining us today, Cait, and for writing your book, Rift.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.